Erev Tov. This week's Torah portion is Shoftim. And I want to start this way. Do you read the New York Times on the weekend? You know, the book review section. And there's always an article up front in the section where they profile a particular writer. And there's a series of standard questions that they ask. What's your favorite book, and how do you organize your books, and when and where do you like to read books, and if you had to invite favorite authors to a dinner party, who would they be, right? So I was imagining, what if Moses, author of the 5 books of Moses, was profiled in the New York Times? Where did I get up this from? In chapter 17, verse 18, we're told about a king. And it reads, "When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read it in all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws." So I'm imagining that the king, would be reading this book, and they went back to Moses, and they asked him a series of questions. So here's my imagining the New York Times book review, profiling Moses ben Amram. Underneath it says, author of Deuteronomy, Numbers, Leviticus, Exodus, and Genesis. So here's what it begins with. First question, what books are on your bedstand? And Moses answers, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Code of Hammurabi. These were two of the great, the first one, Epic of Gilgamesh, is from Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and in it we find a story about a flood long before Moses came up with the story of Noah and the ark. So you've got the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Code of Hammurabi, which is maybe 300-400 years before Moses. And it's a law code, and it's often fascinating to see the difference between the earlier Code of Hammurabi and Moses's Exodus or Deuteronomy and all the laws. And Moses, telling about these books that he's reading, says, I'm fascinated by the similarities in storytelling, like the flood stories, as well as the commonalities and differences in the law codes of two peoples. So we get this idea that the Torah, the laws in the Torah, didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of the Middle East, the ancient Near East, and there already were so many laws. What the Torah came to do was not so much invent new things, it did that occasionally, but mainly it was to either affirm what was already done or go against particular laws or amend them slightly. Second question to Moses, do you prefer reading on papyrus or parchment? Moses says, I miss the days when we sat by the campfire and the elders told our stories orally. Back in Egypt, everything was papyrus. But out here in the wilderness, finding reeds is next to impossible. So we rely on animal hides. I find parchment is much more durable. And how many times have we read, do you prefer reading on the Kindle, or do you prefer a hardbound book or a paperback? Similar question to Moses here. We go on. Your works include narrative, poetry, and legal material. Which genre are you most comfortable in? Poetry is the most difficult, so I'm proudest of those pieces like The Song at the Sea and Ha'azinu. Song at the Sea, of course, Az Yashir Moshe, after crossing the Red Sea. And Ha'azinu is just before Moses dies. That's going to be his final vision and blessing to the people of Israel in the end of Deuteronomy. The law collections are my most important work, but I'm sure that what people will remember and cherish the most are the stories. Question: what figures from literature would you invite to a dinner party? I'm intrigued by Abraham, his long journey from Ur to Canaan, Ur in what today would be southern Iraq, Canaan, of course, Israel. His courage in arguing with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and his relations with the Pharaoh in his day. I'd love to compare notes with him about all of those things. Question: what are you working on now? Final editing of my 5 books. I've discovered some grammatical mistakes, as well as a number of duplications and contradictions. I'd like to get it right before my time is up, but my day job doesn't leave me much free time. And of course, when biblical scholars read the Bible, the Torah specifically, they find that there are grammatical mistakes. They find that there are stories that seem to be repeated. There are 3 stories in Genesis that tell about a Pharaoh twice wanting Sarah and then wanting the wife of Isaac. And in each case, the patriarch telling his wife, "You got to save me, say I'm your brother." And then finally, if you could require a future king to read just one book, what would it be? The Torah, of course. It's a reminder of who we are and where we came from, and it lays out very clearly what God expects us to do. Chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, which is this week's Torah portion, admonishes the king, quote, not to act haughtily towards his fellows, or deviate from the instruction to the right or the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. It can't be any clearer than that. So that would be the New York Times if Moses was the featured writer. So let's look in chapter 18 of the book of Deuteronomy. And in verse 9, we read the following. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. Let no one be found among you who consigns his son or daughter to the fire, or who is an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. For anyone who does such things is abhorrent to the Lord. And it is because of these abhorrent things that the Lord your God is dispossessing the people that you're coming to their land before you. So here's my imagining an argument that's going to take place between 2 prominent figures. Number 1 is Joshua bin Nun, who, of course, was initially the military leader, and at the death of Moses becomes the leader of the people, and between Pinchas ben Eleazar HaKohen. Pinchas was the grandson of Aaron, and he is known infamously for murdering an Israelite and a Midianite who were fornicating in the presence of the tent of the Lord. And so Joshua, who's going to lead the people into the new land where all these Canaanites are, and Pinchas, who had this extremist streak within him. So you shall not learn to imitate the practices of those nations. So I'm imagining the following discussion or argument. Joshua says, Moses explained exactly what he had in mind in the next sentence, consigning children to fire. That refers to worship of Moloch. And indeed, there was a tradition, Moloch, the god of fire, and a child, often a baby, was taken and was thrown into the fire as a sacrifice to the god of Moloch. Or being an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells or consults ghosts or spirits or inquiries of the dead. In other words, it's the religious practices of the Canaanites that we are to avoid. The key word in the sentence is abhorrent. It's their religious practices that are abhorrent. They alone we must not imitate. But Pinchas wants to go beyond that. I read verse 9 independently of verse 10. Don't do what they do. The key word is imitate. We are being warned, stay away from these people and all the things that they do. Don't speak the same language they do. Don't dress like they do. Don't educate your children like they do. Don't eat the same foods that they do. Don't engage in the same occupations or leisure activities that they do. So Joshua says we're about to enter the land. We shouldn't follow the religion or the religious customs of the Canaanites. Pinchas says we shouldn't do anything that they do. Whatever they do is treif. You know, there are one of the interesting questions that often comes up about funerals or visiting the grave is the issue of flowers. And most of us have heard and probably believed Jews don't bring flowers to the cemetery or to a funeral. And there's no real basis for that in Jewish law. Ultimately, we don't do it because that's what Christians did. So it was a way of separating. And if you could imagine, we probably have this same kind of discussion or argument to this very day. When you're dealing with the ultra-Orthodox who take the opinion of Pinchas, whatever they do is treif. We don't do any of it. We don't dress like them, even to wear a tie. You know, in the yeshivish world, they wear a white shirt, black suit, of course the hat, black hat. But the idea of wearing a tie among many ultra-Orthodox Jews is considered, this is something that Goyim do, and we don't do that. And even those ultra-Orthodox yeshiva where they do wear a tie, it's always loosened and never worn tight around the neck. And that's just a small example. Another example would be Thanksgiving. Most, all non-Orthodox Jews in America would say, Thanksgiving, it's a lovely, wonderful American holiday. What's the problem? Even most modern Orthodox Jews would say, it's not a religious thing, perfectly fine. But the ultra-Orthodox would say, once again, even though there's nothing about Thanksgiving in and of itself that is objectionable, because that's what Gentiles do, then we don't do it. So this is this basis that goes on to this very day. I'm imagining that it goes all the way back to Joshua and Pinchas debating what exactly did Moses mean when he gave this tradition. So Joshua comes back and he says, there's a good chance that we can't or won't drive away or exterminate every Canaanite. We're going to have to live with these people. They're going to be our neighbors. Some things we will have to keep separate from them. how we worship our God. But everything else we can and must share. That's the key to peace. And again, fascinating that it would be Joshua the general, the military leader, who's not looking to do more fighting and killing than is absolutely necessary. But the religious leader, Pinchas, grandson of Aaron the Kohen, he takes a more extremist view. And Pinchas says, "You and I know better than anyone else the threat that our neighbors pose to us. Do you think that the Canaanites are any different than the Amalekites and the Midianites? Didn't you lose enough men fighting them? I saw with Cozbi bat Sur and Zimri ben Salu how easy it is for us to be seduced by our neighbors." Those were the two people, Cozbi the Midianite woman and Zimri ben Salu, the Israelite man, who were fornicating in the presence of God's tabernacle, whom Pinchas killed. I say, kill them all. And if we can't, then we have to build walls of separation between us and them. I'm not so concerned about peace. I'm worried about survival. So not only do we see that this was a question between Joshua and Pinchas at that time, it's an issue that continues to this very day. To what extent in America are we Americans? Can we follow American customs? Can we acculturate? Not so much assimilate, but acculturate, bring into our traditions which are not objectionable from a religious Jewish point of view. And even in Israel, you have this same idea that we're living among Arabs. And to what extent do we get along with them? And to what extent do we need to, in a sense, suppress them, if not, oppress them, but keep them behind walls, make sure that they don't come into our cities, that they can't shoot rockets at us. So you've got some people in Israel who are looking for coexistence, and others who see it strictly as a matter of survival. Let's look at chapter 19 in the book of Deuteronomy. And here we've got, in verse 14, one of the laws that Moses brings is, "You shall not move your countrymen's," here we go, "shall not move your countrymen's landmark, set up by previous generations, in the property that will be allotted to you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess." Today, if there's a dispute between neighbors, you can always go to town hall, and there's an exact reckoning of exactly where the property line is, and where you can build, how far from that line you can do things on your own property. But obviously you didn't have that 3,000 years ago. So people put up markers, this is my land, and I'm putting up a stone wall to indicate this is my property and over there is your property. Good fences make good neighbors, Robert Frost wrote. So the idea is you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side. And if we're going to have peace, we need to respect the property markers, the gvul in Hebrew. But I'm imagining the following story. In the middle of the night, the man and his two sons stealthily approached the edge of their property line. They found the fence separating their land from their neighbors, By moonlight, they uprooted their fence and began carrying it onto the adjacent property. They passed a line of their neighbors' olive trees. About 25 yards from their own property, the father called out in a whisper, "Here!" The three men then got on their hands and knees and quietly began digging post holes. When they had reached a depth of about 2 feet, they stood up and sunk the fence posts into the holes. When their work was done, they wiped their dirty hands on their cloaks and headed for home. All three wondered how long, if ever, until our neighbor discovered that we have enlarged our farm at his expense. And if and when he does, what would ensue? Hurt feelings, anger, or bloodshed? Moses awoke from his dream and wondered, "Is this what will become of my people without me? What can I do to prevent such actions?" He arose from his bed and grasped his quill and some parchment. Moses wrote the following words to be added to the scroll of laws. "You shall not move your countrymen's landmarks, set up by previous generations, in the property that will be allotted to you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess." So I'm imagining, how did Moses come up with all of these laws? Did they come straight from God, and Moses was simply the secretary, the scribe writing it down, copying it? Or did Moses, as leader of the people, dealing with their problems, their arguments, their troubles on a day-to-day basis, figured out, what am I going to do about this? And here he has this nightmare about what might happen between neighbors, and so, realizing he's not going to be around forever, he comes up with a law. And it comes straight from his head and his heart, and it's his way of trying to protect his people in the future. He lay down again, but couldn't fall back to sleep. Is that going to be enough? Just telling them what not to do? He knew the answer. He got up again and added another line to the blessings and curses ceremony he was putting together in his mind. So if you go ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 27, we're now in Deuteronomy chapter 19. Skipping ahead to 27, verse 17, we read that he puts in a one-liner as part of the blessings and curses. And it goes like this: "Cursed be he who moves his fellow's landmark, and all the people shall say, Amen." Moses was imagining this ceremony that would take place in Israel as soon as the people crossed the Jordan, in the city of Shechem, where there are 2 mountains north and south of the city. 6 tribes would be on the northern foot of the mountain, 6 tribes opposite on the southern mountain, and in the middle would be the Levites, and the people would face each other across the town. And there would be blessings, and after each blessing, people would say, Amen. And then curses, and each person would say, Amen. Very dramatic kind of ceremony. Moses knew that even that wouldn't be enough to stop people who would be so brazen as to move their property line in order to steal their neighbor's trees. What else can I do? Maybe someday property can be laid out in grids and each lot marked off into blocks and sections, with all land registered in a central location, with magistrates appointed to respond to complaints and take action against violations against property. But I'm old and won't be there to establish such a system. Somebody else will have to deal with it. Heartbroken about all he was leaving undone, Moses lay down again and tried unsuccessfully to fall asleep. So those are 3 chapters from this week's Torah portion. And that brings us to the Haftarah. And this week for Shoftim, we read Haftarah Revi'it de Nechemta, the 4th Haftorah of consolation. Remember, we're going from Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple, 7 straight weeks of Haftorahs, all with the theme of comfort and consolation, from the prophet Isaiah coming to the Jews in exile in Babylonia. Isaiah telling them God still loves us, he won't abandon us, he will bring us back, we will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So here's what I'm imagining. And remember, I've been saying over and over again, my main insight into Haftorahs is that these are to be understood as beautiful as the speeches are. They are really to be understood as street theater, and that the prophet, in order to draw a crowd and impress people, used not so much the highfalutin words, but used actions, and that showed the people what he had in mind. So here's what I'm imagining. Isaiah chapters 51 and 52. An hour before dawn, a man walked through the streets of town. There was no light, there was no sound. The man pulled out a shofar and began blowing it. Between blasts, he took his walking stick, began beating it on the doors of the houses. Hitorri, Hitorri, get up! Uri, Uri, wake up! Groaning was heard inside the houses. Here and there a candle was lit. Windows were opened and people peered outside. What time is it? Who's making all that noise? What's the matter? Most of the people in the neighborhood were now standing outside, rubbing their eyes, yawning, trying to make sense of what was happening. The prophet looked at the people, barefoot and in their night clothes. Get dressed. Put on your fanciest clothes. Are you crazy? It's practically the middle of the night, one of the neighbors screamed at the man. Why are you waking us up? And the prophet says, I'm waking up Zion. I'm telling Jerusalem to dress in her finest robes. You have been sitting like a mourner on the ground. Get up, brush yourself off. Put down that cup of wine you have been drinking to dull the pain of your grief. Arise and come, Zion. Sit again on your throne, Jerusalem. Shah! Listen, can't you hear? Footsteps. It is the sound of the herald coming from the mountains to tell us that happiness and good fortune await us. Let the ruins of our holy city rejoice, for we shall return. Our God is king. Fear nothing. God will march before us and lead us, and he will be our rear guard and protect us. And the man continued on to the next street, where the muffled sound of his shofar was heard, along with the banging of his stick on other people's doors. Hitorri, Uri, wake up, arise. So just an interesting note. Here we have Isaiah, maybe in the year 550, who is telling us, you think you're in mourning, but arise, put on your best clothes. We're all going back to Jerusalem, and it's time to wake up from not only our physical slumber, our metaphorical slumber as exiles, as losers, as defeated people. What's fascinating, though, is this Haftorah, which is recited every year around this time, just before September. Somebody in Israel, in Safed, in the 16th century, maybe the first quarter, middle half of the 16th century, whose name was Shlomo Alkabetz. His family had originally been from Spain. They got kicked out in 1492. They probably sailed from Spain down maybe to the coast of Africa, maybe to Egypt. And from Egypt, they then were able to sail up to the coastline of the land of Israel, maybe around Jaffa, which was the most important port. And from Jaffa, they headed east across the land and settled in Tzfat, up in the Galilee, in the hills. And Shlomo Alkabetz was still dealing with the trauma of his family being kicked out of Spain, probably losing everything. Jews had been in Spain. There had been a golden age of Spain in the 12th century. And after hundreds of years there, Jews are worthless and have to leave. So what did Shlomo Alkabetz do? He read this Haftorah, and he used a number of the lines, a number of the images to write a beautiful poem. The poem is called Lecha Dodi. We sing it every single Friday night in synagogue. What used to happen is Shlomo Alkabetz and Isaac Luria and the other mystics who were living in Tzfat at this time, they used to go Friday afternoon, dress in white, and they go out to the fields and watch as the sun set. And at that moment, the sun was setting. It went from Friday into Shabbat. And they would say, Lecha Dodi likrat kala. Come, my beloved, let us go out to greet the bride. Right? Just like today at a wedding, bride shows up, everybody rises to greet her. Similarly, they're saying Shabbat was like a bride, and we're going to go out to greet Shabbat, the bride. And so what did Shlomo Alkabetz do? He used a number of the phrases from this Haftorah in particular in order to make his point. So for instance, we read in verse 17 in chapter 51 of Shoftim's Haftorah, Hit orari, kumi Yerushalayim. Okay, and the English, rouse yourself, arise, O Jerusalem. So this idea that, then we see in chapter 52, it says, Uri, livshi uzech Zion, livshi bigdei tifartech, Yerushalayim ir hakodesh. Awake, O Zion, clothe yourself in splendor, put on your robes of majesty, Jerusalem, holy city. And then there's a beautiful line that comes, verse 7 in chapter 51, Ma navu al heharim. How wonderful, how welcome is the sound on the mountains of Raglei Mivaser, the footsteps of the herald who is announcing the good fortune, the idea that the Messiah will be sent. We hear him coming, maybe the shofar, and he comes to tell us it is time for us to return to our homes. And at the verse 2, top of page 1110 in the Chumash, Hit na'ari me'afar kumi. Arise, shake off the dust. Come, sit on your throne, Jerusalem. Yerushalayim. So this idea of alphabets in the 1500s borrowing the words of Isaiah, just as Isaiah was telling the exiles in 550 BCE, it's okay, God still loves us. We're going to return, we're going to rebuild our temple. So too, Shlomo Alkabetz, borrowing those words, was telling the people in 1550, give or take, was telling them the same message. God still loves us. Right now, we're in Tzfat because Jerusalem is nothing but rubble. But one day we shall return to Jerusalem. One day we shall rebuild our temple. And so we have Lecha Dodi as Shlomo Alkabetz dealing with the tragedy in his own time, his own lifetime, borrowing the words from Isaiah dealing with the tragedy of his own lifetime. And so we see layer upon layer of how rich Jewish tradition is, and history repeating itself, and themes coming back over and over again. So that's our Parsha, Shoftim, this week. We'll take a break and we'll reconvene at 8:30 for Mariv.